Beautiful people of Africa, welcome to another edition of the program. It is Global Insight on the Pan-African Television for you, Media Africa. Welcome to this edition, which is informative, of course, and we're going to have a greater insight looking at the crisis or the bilateral crisis between Ukraine and Russia. A discussion today was going to focus on the Ukraine crisis and looking at how President Volodymyr Zelensky's Western agenda has largely hindered a quick resolve to the crisis. The potential for a diplomatic solution is being hindered by the influence of Western agenda, and today we are going to uncover this in the course of this edition of Global Insight. Our guest of honor, who is Russia's first permanent representative to the United Nations, will provide insightful meaning on the development in Ukraine, taking us to the start point, that is the genesis of the crisis, and how the role of the collective West has further deteriorated or derailed an end to the crisis. Stay tuned as we are engaged in this insightful and thought-provoking program. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. If you are just tuning in, you're welcome to For You Media Africa, your Pan-African television. And this is the second edition of the program Global Insight. Today we want to take focus on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Like we underlined in the preamble, we're going to have an insightful analysis of the crisis, taking us back to the genesis and the developments which have occurred so far as the bilateral agreement is concerned. We're answering the question, of course, if Zelensky's Western agenda has further derailed the quick resolve to the crisis. Russia's first permanent representative to the United Nations in the person of DMITRY Polyansky will be giving us an insightful detailing or analysis of the program, and of course I will join you right after the transition. Thank you so much. Of course, we go straight away to business. And of course, our first question is focusing on the genesis of the crisis rocking Russia and Ukraine. You know, people came to know about the crisis when the special military operation started in 2022. Of course, this is something that has been ongoing for 10 years. So today we are going to uncover this. And the first question is like the armed conflict in Ukraine, Mr. Polyansky, is rooted in 2014 when the coup d'etat in Kyiv led to the confrontation in the Donbass. So the question particularly is, what role do you think the Western countries played in the event that led to the escalation in the Donbass?
The Western countries played a very crucial and very negative role in the Ukrainian tragedy, which apex we are witnessing today. Exactly 10 years ago tomorrow, day by day, we will take note of the 10th anniversary of the so-called Maidan, the protests that erupted in Kiev after President at that moment, Yanukovych, decided not to sign the association agreement between Ukraine and European Union, saying that he needs a little bit more time to evaluate the consequences for the country after the implementation of this document. It followed several months of very deep deliberations between all sides, European side, Ukrainian side, Russian side, when we tried to explain what will be the consequences of how it will affect bilateral relations and trade between Ukraine and Russia. It was nothing but about trade, and the impact would have been devastating. We were proving this with figures, and our Ukrainian colleagues, a lot of our Ukrainian colleagues, including those working with President Yanukovych, were not aware of this. were not aware of these calculations and modeling of how it will develop. So at some point of time, when the information has become overwhelming, they decided to make this U-turn, to pause, not to denounce, but to pause the signature of the association agreement. But the problem is that by that time, the West, which has invested a lot of money in the formation of the NGOs and other civil society actors who were promoting pro-Western agenda, who were trying to introduce into the heads of Ukrainian citizens the idea that they should disrupt any ties with Russia and that Ukraine's future is within the European Union and NATO, and that they will be welcomed there wholeheartedly. Those NGOs were already working, and they were not ready to denounce, and they were not ready to wait. So they decided to come to action. And these protests were also preceded by several years of very intense nourishing of very radical Ukrainian nationalism. So several years before that, during the presidency of predecessor of Mr. Yanukovych, Mr. Yushchenko, Bandera, one of Hitler's collaborators, was announced to be a hero of Ukraine, and a lot of ideology which has never been present in Ukraine was introduced from the western part of this country, from those who came back from immigration, from those who were children and grandchildren of children and grandchildren of those who were fighting alongside with fascists against the Red Army, who were committing the crimes of Holocaust and persecution of many hundreds of thousands of Jews, of Russians, of Ukrainians, of other nationalities, of Poles. So at this moment, exactly 10 years ago, the protests erupted, and then it came to the apex in February of the next year, when the attempts of President Yanukovych to make a deal with the opposition, the attempts that were crowned by a draft agreement, which was guaranteed by several European countries, when it was absolutely denounced by the opposition the next day when it was signed, and instead of pursuing the road to national dialogue, they ousted President Yanukovych, did it in a very unconstitutional manner, with the direct involvement of actors from the West, some of them very prominent figures, like Victoria Nuland, who was coming repeatedly during the Maidan protests, which at some point became very, very violent, and there were several dozens of people killed in a very mysterious circumstances, and there has never been a proper investigation, and a lot of people basing their position on the documents believe that this was a clear-cut provocation from the opposition, and then the events started to develop in an uncontrollable manner, and there was a lot of violence. Some people in Ukraine, in eastern and southern Ukraine, didn't accept the new ideals that were imposed on them by the new authorities. They were saying that they don't want to support them, and there was a lot of violence from the part of the new Maidan authorities. There was a very heinous massacre in Odessa on the 9th of May, when about 50 people were burnt alive only because of the fact that they didn't want to submit to the nationalists, and they were defending their rights as Russian speakers and as those who live in Odessa. There were violent events in Mariupol. By that time, the residents of Crimea, looking at the scope of the violence that was engulfing the country, decided to return back to Russia. And also in the summer of the next year, instead of having a dialogue with the eastern regions who said that they don't want to support the Maidan coup. The Ukrainian authorities declared a war against the residents of Donbass, and that's how this current stage of Ukrainian tragedy has started after the residential areas of Donetsk and Lugansk were being shelled. The local residents took arms and created self-militias that were trying to stop the aggression of Ukrainian army against its own citizens. And this all was lasting for 9 years, for 8 years before the start of the special military operation of Russia in Ukraine. We tried to find a deal to help the Eastern Ukrainians to find a deal with the Ukrainian government to strike this deal, but actually the Minsk agreements that were signed a year after the eruption of this violence were not implemented by Ukrainian regime, and it was all done with the active involvement of the West, and the West was, of course, masterminding all the actions of Ukrainian government, of Kiev regime. That's why we believe that the West shares the responsibility and is the primary responsible party for what Ukraine is witnessing right now.
Carefully, DMITRY Polyansky. We understand, of course, the stakes as far as the crisis is concerned, and the place of the collective West in derailing of peaceful resolution of the bilateral agreement between Russia and Ukraine. You made mention about several attempts to bring resolve to this. So I want us to dwell so much on the Minsk agreement. How do you assess the significance of the Minsk agreement and the attempts made to resolve the conflict peacefully? How do you assess the role of the Russian Federation and Western countries in this process?
We repeatedly made efforts to help to resolve this inter-Ukrainian conflict, this civil war that erupted.
We're looking at the role of the Russia and Western countries in the process, of course, as far as the Minsk agreement is concerned.
The chance to do so was with the implementation of Minsk agreements, the package of measures which was signed in 2015, the second package. And this package included a lot of concrete steps which would be quite rational for any other country. And they were implemented by OSCE, as you know, but it turned out to be, as we know perfectly well right now, that these disagreements were nothing but a smokescreen for Ukraine and its Western backers to arm Ukraine and to prepare it for a conflict with Russia. And Ukraine was gradually becoming anti-Russia, threatening our country, absolutely despising the rights of Russian-speaking population, which still constitutes majority of Ukrainian population, regardless of what you can read in Ukrainian media. But the Russian language is still omnipresent in Ukraine. Some people are only afraid of using it, but this is their native language, and there is nothing bad elsewhere in the world to promote the rights of minorities, but in Ukraine somehow it started to face problems, and our former Western partners, instead of teaching Ukraine how to deal democratically with all these issues, they started to support the Ukrainian regime, assuming that Russian speakers do not have any future in Ukraine, that Russian language doesn't have any future. All the Western countries have we repeatedly made intensification of shelling of Donetsk and Lugansk when hundreds of thousands of refugees started to come to Russian territory, and it also was preceded by diplomatic moves by my country to to propose treaties on European security to NATO and the United States, which were rejected, condescendingly rejected. So we made several efforts to do so. Then we understood that we are on the eve of a very massive, mass-scale provocation from Ukrainian regime, which might imply massive military operation against Donbass. And then we decided to start our special military operation. And during the pace of our special military operation, the first phase of our operation was very quick. And as you remember, our military were near capital Kyiv and in some other places. So in a month. And during this time, there were several efforts to come to certain negotiated solution. The most important of them almost succeeded at the beginning of April, end of March 2022, when there were talks first in Minsk, then in Istanbul, and when draft treaty was initialed by Ukrainian delegation, this draft treaty had a lot of things that Ukraine is maybe dreaming about right now, but the time has been lost after that. And of course, the condition for moving forward was Ukraine becoming a neutral state, and rights for Russian language, and good neighborhood with Russia. All these things were in this document. And initially, as I said, Ukraine accepted this document, but when it was announced, all of a sudden, Ukraine became a target of a lot of pressure from mostly the UK and the US. And all these people, first and foremost, Boris Johnson, former British Prime Minister who visited Kiev, tried to discourage Zelensky to sign this document and tried to convince him that Ukraine will be capable of winning against Russia and that the terms of this agreement are not good for Ukraine. And he and other Western politicians succeeded in convincing Zelensky that Ukraine could win, and Zelensky rejected this treaty, and instead of this started to invest in a very large-scale military campaign against Russia. So he made a bet on winning militarily against Russia, which was a big and fatal mistake, as we all understand right now, and I think that even himself understands right now. So the role of the West was also key here, and the West was not interested of Ukraine and Russia living in peace, because that was not the reason why the West has triggered this crisis from the outset. So the task was to weaken Russia. Of course, they understand that it's impossible to inflict defeat on Russia, but maybe they also counted that the Russian society will be mobilized against President Putin, that there will be internal unrest, and maybe they would be successful in a regime change in Russia, the things that they have done repeatedly all over the world. This was one of the calculations. And the second, plan B, was just to weaken Russia as much as possible, to get as many losses of Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers as possible, for Russia to be set back at the position where it couldn't challenge the West. And the sanctions that were introduced also by the United States and its allies were also supposed to play a key role in this process, but they all failed. And the sanctions, as you know, are working only to the detriment of those who introduced these sanctions. Also militarily, we all see the position on the battlefield, and the fact that Zelensky rejected this chance for peace, and since then has only offered so-called peace plans, which are not peace plans, because they their key element is de facto capitulation of Russia, which is absolutely out of question. So I think this fact is now analyzed all over the world, and a lot of people understand that the best position in which Ukraine could have good peace has now already passed by, and we don't know in what shape the Kiev regime will be during the next such attempt. But so far there are even no such attempts, and still Zelensky regime has no other way but to claim that it is capable of winning over Russia, because it needs military assistance and equipment from the West, and it needs support, it needs money, and this corrupt country couldn't survive otherwise, but only with this life support, lifeline from the West. So it's a vicious circle, which is very tragic for Ukraine as a country, because hundreds of thousands of people have already perished, and Zelensky regime is using them as a cannon fodder for the pursuit of absolutely foreign geopolitical interests, which have nothing to do with Ukraine, which have nothing to do with the interests of his people. And I think that more and more people understand this, including in Ukraine.
Indeed. And thank you so much. We proceed, of course, to understanding. We know that the conflict in Ukraine and Ukraine and Russia have actually been tabled at the United Nations Security Council. So being a representative at this international body, at the meetings of UN Security Council and the General Assembly, the situation in Ukraine and numerous violations of international law and human rights issues related to the uncontrolled armed supplies were discussed more numerous times. Which of the humanitarian consequences of the crisis and the actions of the Ukrainian authorities do you consider the most destructive? What was the position of Western countries in relation to the facts presented at the United Nations?
All the Western countries have a very short memory when it comes to their own crimes and actions. So they started to behave, and they try to continue the same line even today. They started to behave as if there was absolutely no history before the 24th February 2022. They were claiming that Russian aggression, as they put it, was absolutely unprovoked. It had no reason. It was absolutely a territorial war, though it's absolutely absurd. It's not about territory, of course. It's about the rights of the population of the east and south of Ukraine. So they tried to bring this narrative into action in the United Nations, and initially I know that a lot of countries from the global south, they were overwhelmed by these events, and they absolutely had no time to analyze it thoroughly, and the Western countries succeeded in mobilizing some support for their moves against Russia, for the formula and the one-sided picture that they wanted to promote at the international arena. But very soon, a lot of our sisters and brothers from African countries, from other developing countries, started to see the real picture of what's the role of Western countries in this situation. And this role is not very much difficult from that of colonialist powers several decades ago, when they were trying to divide and rule. They are absolutely trying to introduce discord among brotherly people in Russia and Ukraine. They are absolutely not interested in any kind of cooperation between Ukraine and Russia. This scenario is a bad scenario for them. They don't need peace between Russia and Ukraine. They want to weaken Russia as much as possible. So these countries started to flood Ukraine with weapons, with other military support like military data and the satellite data. They were absolutely complicit in a lot of strikes that Ukrainian military did against civilian objects with the use of this satellite and intelligence data provided by the West. So very soon, our colleagues from these countries of the global South understood that the West is a part of this conflict. It's not a direct part, but NATO, US and its allies are actually masterminding and implementing their agenda in Ukraine, and that the Zelensky regime is not the one that reflects the desires and the priorities of its own people. So we indeed repeatedly draw attention of our colleagues in Security Council and in General Assembly to the factor of Western arms deliveries to Ukraine. These arms deliveries are very significant even at this date, and it's not only a question of arming Ukraine to make it more capable to fight, but it's also a question of making profits from the Ukrainian war. It's the same way as capitalists and colonialists behaved elsewhere in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. They're making profits. For them, it's a business. President Biden openly said recently that it's a good investment, that Ukrainians are dying for American money and American lives are spared. And also the military industrial companies are gaining enormous profits from Ukrainian war. The West is testing its arms in Ukraine, and the West is also making a swamp of equipment swamp, military equipment swamp out of Ukraine, because it provides it mostly with quite an obsolete equipment from Eastern Europe, and then these countries are being rearmed and receiving newer equipment, newer military appliances. So this process is beneficial for the West, and they don't want to put it to an end. And now a lot of our partners in the UN are looking at this situation through the optics that I described, and it's becoming harder and harder for Western countries to mobilize any support for Kiev regime because of what is happening, and because of all the facts that have come to the ground about the real intentions of Kiev regime and its Western backers. And we see more and more support from the developing countries in the UN and in the world in general.
Absolutely, and from what you've said, we see how controversial the crisis is, even in present day society. And I can actually relate with that somehow, because in September of 2023, I had this unique opportunity as one of the first African journalists to visit Donbass after the start of the special military operation, and was deeply impressed by the stories I heard there from local residents. So we see that the struggle against the Western hegemony has begun in African countries, and the struggle of the residents of Donbass for sovereignty at different battles of the same war, of course. So the question, Mr. Dmitry Polyansky, do you think it is possible to draw a parallels between the situations on the African continent and Eastern Europe? If so, what are the similarities between these historical events?
I think that the parallels are quite obvious, and what we see now with the actions of current Western countries is a true face of neocolonialism, of this neocolonialist practice. So it's a new form. It's different from what it was 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago in Africa or elsewhere. But the task is the same. The task is first and foremost to divide and rule, to weaken the countries that can challenge or defy the Western agenda, that could withstand the colonialists 50, 60, 70 years ago. Now, the hegemonists in the face of the United States in our today's world, So the times have changed, but the methods have remained the same. And these countries, they absolutely do not care about Russia, about Ukraine, in the same way that they didn't care and they don't care about Africa, about Asia. So they care only as long as these countries help them to become richer. They only care about education in these countries when they can bring labor force from these countries to the US and European countries. They are not interested on building factories, schools, hospitals there. They just want to exploit their natural resources. And in order to make it happen, they also mobilize some countries against other countries, some peoples against other peoples. All this divisive agenda, I think, is quite known by our African brothers and sisters, and it's the main reason of the crisis that is happening all over the African continent for many years to go. And there is no end to this crisis, exactly because the Western countries are not interested in stopping this crisis. They don't want any change there, and they are very jealous when it comes to Russia or China, which offer alternative agenda for African countries that are based on independence, that are based on mutual respect, on creating conditions for internal growth. They are very jealous because this exposes their agenda, and their agenda is absolutely different. They want to exploit, they want to steal money, and they don't need any stability in the region. So they are now trying to portray the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as a conflict for the territory, as Russia being aggressive towards its neighbor. But can you imagine living in Africa and knowing how many peoples are living in different countries across the border? Can you imagine how acute this problem is? And can you imagine how would the countries, the African countries, react if their neighbors oppressed their compatriots, the people of the same tribe, of the same nation, if they forbade them to speak their own language and to uphold their own version of history? How many conflicts would have sparked? How many more conflicts would have sparked in Africa because of that? And at the same time, you will see that you will say countries like, for example, Belgium or Switzerland. It's okay in Belgium to speak French and to speak Netherlands, Flemish. Nobody is saying that the French-speaking Belgians are supposed to speak Flemish or English. This is okay. This is normal. In Switzerland, you can speak German, you can speak French, you can speak Italian, and your rights will be protected. But when the Russian speakers who really represent majority of the population, when they try to uphold their rights and say that they have the right to speak their own native language and to have education in their language for their children, they are deprived of this right. Now there are ridiculous things coming from Ukraine, ridiculous and even dangerous. Yesterday, for example, one of the speakers of the Ukrainian parliament of the Zelensky regime, he said that there is no such thing as Russian minority in Ukraine. I could agree that there is no such thing as Russian minority because there is Russian majority in Ukraine. We absolutely denies any rights to these people. He says that they have no right to speak their own language. Can you imagine how it is being viewed in Russia and in these regions of Ukraine as such? And I think that in Africa, all these problems should be really processed with the heart and with the mind, and so they should be extrapolated at your own experience with the colonizers and in the way they are treating your countries and in the way they were and are still trying to stall the future of your countries and to stall the possibilities for independent development. So absolutely in the same way they are trying to behave against Russia, with the only difference that with Russia it will not happen, and there is no such a scenario. They only want to weaken our country because they see in our country a very dangerous challenger of American hegemony in the world, and that's the only reason why they started all these things.
And I can attest, of course, that the latest development around the global world have actually shown to what extent the Western or collective West has hijacked the bilateral disagreement between Ukraine and Russia for its own benefit. And this will align also with the next question. We see how Israel's military actions against Palestine revealed the double standards of the West and shifted the focus of attention of the mainstream media. In this situation, Ukraine does not receive the attention and unlimited financial support that it was already used to. Has Ukraine's desire to follow the Western agenda prevented the possibility of finding these diplomatic solutions with the Russian Federation? Of course, this question capitalized more on our topic for discussion.
Yes, indeed. The situation in Gaza has opened eyes of a lot of our colleagues on what was happening in Ukraine as well, because there are blatant double standards in the approaches of the West towards the Ukrainian situation and what's now happening in Gaza. There was a piece of news, I think several days ago, from Israel, that almost 4,000 refugees from Israel decided to return to Ukraine because they say that it is much safer in Ukraine than in Israel right now. And this absolutely contradicts the whole line of Western propaganda, which tried to present actions of Russia in Ukraine as targeted against civilians, despite the fact that we repeatedly warned that we are not targeting civilian objects, and that the damage that is being caused to civilian objects is mostly the result of the faulty work of Ukrainian air defense, which is being placed in the residential areas in total breach of international humanitarian law. So it turns out to be that the Ukrainian cities, after almost 2 years of our special military operation, continue to live more or less normal life. If you browse internet, you will see pictures of nightlife in Kiev, in Odessa, in Kharkov. On the other hand, you may look at the pictures of Gaza. You will see what kind of devastation is being caused if a country is indiscriminately shelling residential areas and residential zones, as we were accused of doing so in Ukraine, absolutely wrongly and baselessly accused. What's happening in Gaza resembles rather the US tactics in Mosul or in Raqqa, which we all remember, when the city is almost erased from the surface on the earth. But at the same time, the fallout of this, the reaction of this to this from Western media and from Western politicians is very mild, is very modest. So it's absolutely clear that the West is analyzing the situation in Ukraine and situation in Gaza through the optics of who is the friend and who is the foe of the West. So if Russia is the foe of the West, then of course it can't be a good country, it can't behave in a good way, whatever it does. And there is a lot of Western propaganda trying to attribute to us things that we never did. On the other hand, if Israel is being presented as the only democracy in the Middle East, it's not my quote, but it's the quote of some American politicians and European politicians. Of course, it's not supposed to be criticized, and its methods are not supposed to be criticized. And we see how the West is implementing these blatant double standards. And I think that the West has lost a lot of credibility after the events in Gaza started, and a lot of people saw their clear parallel with the Ukrainian situation with the way Russia is being treated and accused by the West.
Indeed, taking into account the conflict that maybe the conflicts that are erupting in different regions from Eastern Europe to Africa, how do you think the geopolitical transformation will actually develop, and what will the world be in let's say approximately 5 years with the changes that are happening not just in Africa but across the international arena that is actually hijacking the international cooperation at every level?
Well, it's very difficult to predict these kind of things. And one thing is for sure, that the world has changed and the world will never be the same as it was before the beginning of this hot stage of Ukrainian crisis, and also before the Israel's actions in Gaza. The world has changed, and we are now only seeing the shape of this world. What we know for sure in Russia, that the so-called Pax Americana is definitely over. So nobody is willing to succumb to the pressure of the US, to its hegemony, and nobody has asked the US and its allies to play the role of world policemen, what they are doing everywhere in the world. So it's quite clear that militarily the situation of the Kiev regime is far from being perfect. They are out of manpower. They are very much doubtful in terms of receiving more significant Western military assistance, and without Western military assistance, they're absolutely incapable of fighting of their own. It's not a revelation that Zelensky has squandered already several armies in terms of military equipment, and he's now only surviving like a drug addict, only at the with the help of Western assistance and Western aid. So the changes are looming, and the horizon for the end of hostilities in Ukraine is also looming. I don't know. I'm not a prophet to predict how and when it will end, but I'm absolutely sure that all the aims of our special military operation will be achieved. What we don't want, we don't want to have a hornet's nest on our borders, a neo-Nazi formation, a nationalist formation, provoking Russia and abusing Russian speakers. I think that not a single country would tolerate this. Russia is not an exception. So we will be very much favorable to finding a fair solution, fair peace in Ukraine, which would be based on the implementation of these goals of our special military operation. So we never withdrew from negotiating table. It's not us who is doing so. It's enough to mention that Zelensky himself forbade himself to be part of negotiation problems when last year he introduced a bill which is forbidding him to enter negotiations with Russian government. So I can't understand how it will be possible for him theoretically to start negotiations if this bill is enforced. There are a lot of things that we also do not tolerate in Ukraine. We can't accept the prosecution of canonical orthodoxy in Ukraine. What is being done is absolutely heinous and criminal. And we are also attracting attention to this because there is a political project in Ukraine that is being imposed on its population. The population does not buy it, but still Zelensky regime tries to get rid of the canonical Orthodox Church, which was present at these lands for hundreds of years and which is being supported by the majority of its population. This is also criminal. And at the same time, I can reassure you that regardless what you might read in the Western media or what Western politicians would tell you, we still remain very close countries, Ukraine and Russia. Our peoples remain very close. It's enough to say that there are several millions, I think 5 million of Ukrainians who found refuge in Russia after the beginning of the hostilities. And it makes Russia the biggest country for those who fled Ukrainian crisis. It means that Ukrainians are safe in Russia. Ukrainians are not afraid. Nobody is infringing on their rights. in Russia, and it totally contradicts the narrative that is being promoted by the West, that Russians hate Ukrainians, that Russians want to kill Ukrainians, that Russians want Ukrainian lands. No, it's not about land. This conflict is absolutely not about land. We have enough of land in Russia. It's a question of human rights, it's a question of dignity, and it's a question of making an end to the Western interference into our country's affairs, into the affairs of our neighbors, and to stop this policy of setting up flames around our borders, of regime changes, and all these things for which the West is so famous and so notorious. So this is all about it, and I think that the victory is looming. It's inevitable, whatever the Western politicians would claim and do. As for the Middle East, it's very difficult to predict, because this is unfortunately only initial stage of this crisis. And we will try, and we are doing the most possible things as much as we can to stop this fighting, to save the people of Gaza, to save Palestinians, and to come back to the situation when the Security Council decisions on the independent Palestine living in peace and harmony with Israel would be implemented. We are unfortunately quite far from this, and we are quite far also because of what the West is doing, what the United States is doing, because they are absolutely not interested in such a scenario. They are interested in upholding the position of Israel, and they want to do everything for Israel to continue its military operation in Gaza and to find a solution that would be favorable to Israel. And this is, of course, not fair. And I think that the majority of peoples in the world understand this quite clearly. And Russia is with all these people to promote the fair case of Palestinian people.
The fact that the Russian-Ukraine crisis has actually affected not just the people in Eastern Europe, but it's the African continent has suffered from the start of the crisis till date. So the question I would like to channel to you this time around, Mr. DMITRY Polyansky. How do you see the Russia-Ukraine conflict impacting African nations and the broader global community in terms of new transformations in the world?
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the viewers. And I'm absolutely sure that Africa will have a bright future together with Russia as one of the polars of the multipolar world, which is being born right now. And I think that we can always count on Russia in defending the African interests, and we are doing this in the United Nations, and we will be doing this elsewhere with your help and with your support. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for accepting to talk to the Pan-African Media for You media, DMITRY Polyansky. Thank you for your insightful analysis on the development regarding the Russia-Ukraine crisis in the present day society. It's always a pleasure, and of course I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking out time to be with us. And of course information is always on the move on the Pan-African Television for You Media Africa. I want to thank you for your confidence. Keep having a lovely moment in the company of our transmissions, and see you some other time.